Let's dive into our examples. We're going to begin with subnetting a Class A network using FLSM. In the first example, we need to divide a Class A network 50.0.0.0 into two equal networks. We're going to need two identical networks, and then we're going to have to determine network address for each of those networks, first usable address, last usable address, and a broadcast address for both of those networks. Then we're going to look at the binary format of each of these addresses, and then we're going to transfer that into the decimal format. First, let's calculate the binary value of our Class A IP address. The first bit, which has a value of 128, is going to be switched off because we don't need it. The second bit is 64, and we don't need that either. The third bit from left to the right is going to be 32, and we're going to need that. So that bit is going to be turned on. The next one is 16. 32 plus 16 is 48, so we need that too. The next one is 8, and if we added that to 48, that would be 56. That's too much. The next one is 4, which is also too much if we add that to 48. And the next one is 2. We're going to need that. 48 plus 2 equals 50. And then the last bit is 1. Obviously, we're not going to need that one. And we've got ourselves our first segment or our first octet of our IP address. The next three octets are going to be all zeros, so that's easy. The first 8 bits in this IP address are going to be the network portion. And we know that because all Class A networks are /8 networks. Now, in order to divide this network, we're going to use the first bit after the network portion. We're going to take this bit and join it into the network portion, into the existing 8 bits. So now we're going to have 9 bits representing the network portion. Now, even though this 9th bit is the part of the network portion now, or it's part of the new network portion for the new 2 subnets, it's still going to be 0. So our network address for our first subnet is going to be 50.0.0.0. Our first usable address is going to be the same as this, but we're going to switch the last bit to 1. So we're going to copy all the previous bits, and then we're just going to use 1 at the end. There it is. So the decimal representation of that address is 50.0.0.1. Now our last usable address is going to be the opposite of that. So we're going to take our first 9 bits, which represent the network portion, and we're not going to change that, but we are going to change the remaining bits to 1s, except for the last bit. If we use 1 in our last bit also, that gives us our broadcast IP address. So the last usable IP address is actually going to be the broadcast address minus 1. So this is what that will look like. We copy the network portion, which are the first 9 bits, and then we use all 1s, but the last bit is still going to be 0. And in decimal numbers, that's going to be 50.127.255.254. The broadcast address is going to be, as I mentioned earlier, literally just the next IP address after the last usable IP address. And in decimal numbers, that's going to be 50, 127, 255, 255. For our second subnet, we're going to have to switch our 9th bit from 0 to 1. Actually, this bit could be called the subnet portion. So in this example, we actually have 3 portions. We have the network portion, the subnet portion, and the host portion. So this subnet bit is 0 for the first network and is going to be 1 for the second network. That's going to be, if this is 1, our network address is going to be the first 8 bits, or the first octet is still going to be the same, but then the 9th bit is going to be 1. And then the rest of the bits for the network IP address are going to be zeros. And in decimal format or in decimal numbers, that's 50.128.0.0. To determine our first usable address, we're going to copy the network portion, and then we're going to use all zeros, but for the last bit. For the last bit, we're going to use 1. And in decimal numbers, that's 50.128.0.1. The last usable IP address is just going to be the opposite. So instead of using all zeros after the network portion, we're going to use ones, except for the last bit. The last bit is going to be 0. And in decimal numbers, that's 50.255.255.254. The broadcast IP address is just going to be the next IP address, which is 50.255.255.255.